Hiya, it's Indie and I'm a community archaeologist with Dig Ventures, and today I'll be doing another virtual site tour, this time on a site near Driffield in East Yorkshire. So we've been there for the past 3 years excavating nearly 1,000 years of archaeology, dating all the way from the late Iron Age period up to the medieval, and we've got some really interesting periods of history. And what's been really interesting to see is how these periods of history and archaeology relate to each other. And what we'll particularly be interested in will be that transition period between the late Iron Age leading up to the Roman period, as we've got some of the earliest evidence of this north of the Humber. So with all of our videos, you can leave questions in the live chat as we go along, or you can leave them in a comment at the end of the video. And amongst the team at Dig Ventures, when we put our heads together, we can basically answer any question you would like. So feel free to comment anything, and without further ado, let's get on with the video. So I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of context on the area, other archaeology that's taken place both recently and in antiquity. You'll notice as well that I'm being quite vague with the site location, and that is because, well, I think it'll become clear as we go further down into the video, but also it is private land. So unfortunately, unlike other sites like Lindisfarne, you cannot go and visit them, as that would be trespassing. So what else has been found in the local area? The site is in the Hull Valley, which is quite famous for its Iron Age archaeology, particularly its burial culture. So you may have heard of there's 160 burials at Pollington, and there's also 140 at Wetwang Slack, in which 3 of these were these quite famous, extravagant chariot burials. So you may have seen, if you were watched at the time, our site diaries from our 2018 excavation. We thought that may be what we were looking at from our surface finds. It turns out that's not what the focus of our excavation was on, but this is an area that is quite famous for those Iron Age burials. Another find you may have heard of is the World Roman Newton hoard, which was from roughly 307 AD and contained 1,857 copper coins, making it the largest coin hoard found in northern Britain to date to this period. And to put that into terms you may understand, that's roughly 700 chickens or 1,100 pints of beer. So let us know in the comments, would you rather 700 chickens or 1,100 pints of beer? I side on the chickens. I think that's better value for money, but that could be a year's supply of beer for someone. I don't know, let me know. Moving on, in the 1870s, an archaeologist you may have heard of called John Mortimer began excavations of a Bronze Age burial mound very near to the site where we were excavating. And he found an early Bronze Age person buried with a hawk, a copper dagger, a gold wristband, and some amber beads. And he also found later 46 Anglo-Saxon burials also concealed within the mound. And then there were later excavations that took place just after the First World War, which found a Roman ladder settlement very nearby the site. So it's very clear that there's a lot of archaeology going on here, though there has been no large landscape survey that's really investigated the whole landscape, and particularly in John Mortimer's case, he does look at stratigraphy, but you can definitely see an emphasis on the finds. And what we really wanted to do is to look at this larger landscape and how it is relating to each other and how it's changing over time. And Rob and Paul, who are brilliant, and they were surveying the site, so they both metal detect and field walk, and they do it in a very regimented way, and they were able to map exactly where all these find densities were and in which periods we were getting certain find densities. So they brought the site to our attention, and it was really exciting for us because we had everything from the Iron Age all the way up to the medieval period. So over the last 3 years we've investigated various periods, mainly identified through their field walking, as other forms of surveying actually aren't that applicable because this is quite modernly ploughed fields. Field walking actually works amazing because the ploughing brings up those finds, and they're out of strat anyways, but it can give you an idea of spread, which is really interesting when you're looking at a big large area like this. So they brought this to our attention, and this is why we wanted to investigate the site. And with the help of community archaeology, so everyone who crowdfunded the dig or came to the dig, that's how it happened. So using kind of the community and all this information that Rob and Paul had found, we managed to get a dig to happen. and that's happened over the past 3 years, and we've managed to look at the medieval shrunken village in 2017. We managed to look at the kind of later Roman villa that we found in last year, 2019. We also managed to put some trenches right over where we thought there might be some late Iron Age burials, but actually it turned out to be a Roman mansio, which is one of these very early trading posts set up when the Romans first come north of the Humber. So we found lots of really exciting archaeology which is being made possible through crowdfunding and through the invaluable help of Rob and Paul. So coming on to the first stop on our tour, we're looking at the earliest remains we have that we've excavated so far, and they're the remains we excavated in 2018, where we're looking at a late 1st to mid 2nd century Roman site. Now the Romans first crossed the Humber in AD 71, so we're looking at a settlement roughly contemporary with those very early Roman settlements that are popping up all across the whole valley. So before I talk about why having a site of this date is so important, first I need to tell you what we found on site. So first, we have evidence of buildings. We have robber cuts. So you can see on our site, it almost looks like a rather ephemeral dry stone wall. What that is in reality is where they've taken the good stones out and they've made a big hole where the wall was, and then what they've done is all the stone that either broke whilst they were doing this or just wasn't up to scratch, they've chucked back in because they can't be bothered to transport that stone. So what you end up with is something that resembles a dry stone wall. So when you excavate, actually, we've almost excavated it in reverse. We've removed the earlier stuff down first to reveal the later infilling of a robber trench, when in reality there would have been a much nicer stone wall structure there. So we've got robber trenches, because clearly someone in antiquity has robbed out the stone in this trench, meaning it's probably quite nice. We've also got post holes. They look quite ephemeral here, but they're probably quite heavily truncated, but it does mean that by the later ploughing, because we're obviously in a ploughed field site, but it does mean that we've probably got further structures. Though most of these kind of structural building remains are actually, we have very little of it in the trench. When I'll come on to talk about what we would hopefully like to do in 2020, you'll see that this is particularly the area we wish to target, just because we didn't get, we're looking through a keyhole at the moment. We're having to go off the projected shape of the building, as we don't really have much datable artefacts associated directly with the structures at the moment. Though from the projected shape, we think it's roughly 2nd century AD that this building dates to, which is putting it right at that point where it's like the first Romans living here. Moving away from the structural remains and just looking at some of the artefacts we have got from site, we found 398 potsherds across the site. Now these mostly date to the late 1st to the mid 2nd century AD. And what's quite remarkable about them is the number of them that are thrown on a wheel. So these are much more akin to Roman pottery, as that is technology that's brought in with the Romans, than it is the Iron Age, which is usually handmade through coils or moulded from slabs, which you can see as well if you want to watch Johanna's video. She demos how they made their Iron Age pots. But what's quite remarkable about it is that in the kind of the countryside during this period, you do see a continuation of the Iron Age techniques of pot, opposed to these more Roman pots. So we think they were probably being produced in York or Malton, and in fact they're much more similar to the pottery that's being used in Roman forts of the time, opposed to what we tend to see in the countryside. So it does seem to be very Romanised. We also found 12 coins whilst field walking during 2018, and 3 coins from the topsoil of our excavated area, which again corroborate these dates we're getting from the pottery. So we're quite sure that we can date our site to that period, and we can see quite clearly that it's very Romanised. We've got Roman coins, Roman style pottery, some of it quite nice wares as well, along with these coins. So we can start to see that we've got a very unusual site here. I'm going to move on to some human remains, some of which are neonates and infants, which I'll talk about for a few minutes. So if you don't want to hear about that, come back in a couple of minutes' time. We've had 1 adult burial and 3 neonates that we found during excavations. The adult burial was only partially articulated and was disturbed through the later construction of a wall, or it looked as if it could have been reinterred at some point through. So it was quite heavily disturbed, so it's quite that we didn't find any goods with it, and it was not in its original resting place. So it does seem to potentially have been earlier than quite some of the buildings. What's particularly interesting about the neonates is that these all seem to be very closely associated with the building, either within it or very close. This is quite unusual for Roman practice. If you've ever seen plans of normal Roman sites, you'll see cemeteries tend to be very segregated from living space. The exception, and this isn't uncommon, seems to be of infant burials. Now, with our infant burials, we found one with a Roman penannular brooch, which was made of a copper alloy and dates to either the 1st century BC or 1st century AD. And we also found one with pottery sherds that date to the 1st to 2nd century AD. And so these again seem to be very contemporary with the building and other finds on site. So what we can tell from this is that it's quite a common interpretation of these neonate burials that the Romans are practicing infanticide. Now, we don't think that's what's happening here. In fact, it seems to be rather the opposite, in that these are very carefully placed burials with nice artefacts, and that it's actually probably the people burying them are in mourning, and it is the unfortunate reality of the medicine of the time and the difficulties of childbirth. So why is this Roman date so important? Well, quite importantly, it's not a fort. This is in the countryside, and there's no really evidence of anything military happening. We often think of the Roman invasion as an invasion, whereas there doesn't seem to be any hostility here. This does seem to be a rather peaceful, well-off Roman site. Now, this could be one of two things. It could be that this is land gifted to a veteran after years of service, and he is there to Romanise the area. His coinage could be propaganda to help propel this idea of the Romans in the area. Though what we think is quite likely is this could be a mansio site. So that's a stopping point along a road. And the idea is that when people are moving in between these larger Roman towns and forts, is they can't always necessarily do this journey in a day and need somewhere to stop en route. Now, it's likely that this mansio would have been some sort of trading post and would have been benefiting off the consumer wants of the Romans travelling between these quite well-off and supplied forts. So they could have been trading, which would explain some of the coinage that we found and the wealth of the people that seem to be living here, judging off their pottery. And this theory as well is being supported by Chris, who made some maps using geographical information systems, looking at how far an oxdrawn cart could travel in a day, and the site seems perfectly situated to be a day's walk from 6 nearby forts. So it is very possible that this is some sort of stopping post along a trade route. It seems to be, judging both from the pottery and from the coinage, that these people were very well off and did very well for themselves in the early Roman period. And that kind of brings us on to the second part of the site tour, which is looking at the later Roman sites. And moving on to the second stop on our tour, a possible 3rd to 4th century Roman villa that was excavated during the 2019 excavations. So, how do we know we found a Roman villa? We did a very detailed video on that in 2019, which you can view in the link below. But to just give you a brief overview as to all the things we found that makes us confidently state that we've got a Roman villa, we had tessera, which are the little mosaic floor tile pieces that go to make the mosaic floors. We had Roman roof tiles, so we know that there was Roman buildings. We also had big post holes, and if you go by the general rule that about a third or a quarter of a post will be sunk into a post hole, judging by the size of our post, they could have easily have supported a roof or some upper structure, especially when you consider that these post holes are probably being truncated by later ploughing. So these are quite substantial. We've had hypocausts, which are the underfloor heating systems inside the Roman villa. We know that because we found a box flue tile, which is one of the tiles that go around the pipes that take the hot air throughout the villa. We've had also, other than just building remains, we've had some really nice fine Roman pottery. We've had things like Samian and other nice tablewares, and we've also found a really nice Roman bone pin, which would have adorned some fashionable Roman's hair, and who knows how she lost it, but clearly there were high status Roman people around. So we're pretty confident that we have found another, because this wasn't known until our excavations, Roman villa in the whole valley landscape. But to avoid going into too much detail on that, because you can see a video before, I thought I would actually answer some questions that I know we've had on a couple of other videos to do with pottery. So we often get asked, is pottery local or is it imported? How can you tell? And where is this pottery coming from? So I thought I would use this as an example to talk about where all the pot's coming from. So I thought I would just give a list of some of the Roman pot that we found and where it's come from. So in 2019, we found Samian, which is produced in Gaul, which is modern day France. So that is definitely an imported ware. And in fact, salient is exported throughout the whole Roman Empire. It's a very fashionable tableware pottery that you just see. It's kind of ubiquitous with Romans. We also had Nene Valley ware, which is from the Nene Valley, which is in the Midlands. We've had mortarium, which was manufactured near York. And we've had grey wares that have come from loads of kilns, including those in Lincolnshire, Stamford Bridge, or the Holme on Spalding Moor. So you can see even the local wares are coming from a range of different kilns. You may be thinking, well, how can you narrow it down that specifically? Well, what we do is when sites are excavated, so for example, the kiln near Castle Howard in North Yorkshire, they will have lots of wasteware, so that's pottery that hasn't been fired correctly. And because it's not fired correctly, it's never taken because it's not usable and it is binned on site. So when you get these kind of mass dumps of wasteware pottery, you can be reasonably confident you've got a kiln site. And if you look at what makes up that wasteware pottery, you can get an idea of what pottery is being produced at that site. And then you can compare it to pottery in other sites and see if it was being produced in that kiln. Now, obviously that's quite technical work, and a specialist is who looks at that for us. So they've got lots of experience and lots of reference books, which is how they can tell that for us. So what did 2019 tell us? Well, it told us that we've got a new villa site that wasn't known before, which is really exciting. And it's quite interesting how this is fitting into a much larger landscape of lots of these villas. They're actually rather common in the 3rd to 4th century, these farmsteads that are popping up all over the landscape. So this is very much an agricultural landscape, and it's very it's being kind of controlled and monitored by the Romans. So you see this true Romanisation. They've got Roman imported wares. They're using very typical Roman manufacturing techniques for lots of their pot. You see everything is very Romanised. You've got Roman style buildings, and you start to see how this kind of agricultural landscape is starting to reflect the Romans, as well as just these larger cities and forts like we had in the earlier periods. So you see this kind of change from this particular rural site being unusual in that it's a mansio and it is profiting off kind of the forts and the bigger cities that pop up to Rome, to the landscape actually being rather Romanised and controlled in a large scale by the Romans. The final stop on our tour is looking at some of the most recent archaeology we investigated during this project, and that's looking at the village of Little Driffield and how this has changed over time. So we knew that this would have been an important place during the Anglo-Saxon period. It's rumoured to be the burial place of King Alchred, King of Northumbria, who died in 1704-5. It's also supposed to be the place of a lost royal Anglo-Saxon palace. And it does seem that it actually probably would have been an important place in Anglo-Saxon times, judging off the quality of the stone carvings and an Anglo-Saxon cross that's incorporated into the fabric of the church that's still there today. Though we weren't looking for the Anglo-Saxon, we were looking for the foundations of the original village. We used a mixture of field walking and excavation, both to map the extent of the original village and also to characterise what it looked like. So through field walking, we know that the village was originally much larger. In fact, we think at some point it shrunk to 40 to 50% in size. And we think that happened in the mid-14th century based on these field walking results. And from excavation, we could characterise what this village looked like. So we know that it was established at some point between the 11th to 13th century, but we can also see from the animal bones that they were eating quite nice quality cuts of meat. And it seems to be quite a high status settlement. So why did it so drastically shrink in size? Now we think this could actually be to do with some historical events that we know happened in the mid-14th century. During this period, it's quite tumultuous for northern Britain with lots of Scottish raids. This could have impacted on the town's viability. It's also the onset of the 100 Years' War, which affected quite a lot of Britain. It's also during the middle of the Black Death, and this could have majorly impacted the village of Little Driffield. So we see a big reduction in size to its current size, which would have been maybe 50 to 40% the size of the original village. But to look at some of the showcase finds from the site, we had lots of green glaze wares, and this is something again that you can have a look for when you're doing your daily walks, as they're quite identifiable, and when you know you've got one, you know you're holding a piece of medieval pottery. Now these have these really bright green shiny glazes on them, and they're often decorated as well. So we found lots of these very stereotypical medieval wares. We also found a Roman coin. We found very little Roman during this site, but We had the few pieces of sherds of pottery and this nice Roman coin, so we knew that there was a Roman settlement nearby, which, as you've seen, we found during 2018 and 19. So whilst we didn't have any directly in Little Driffield, we did know at this point that there would have been something in the slightly further out into the landscape. The other nice little find we got was a little spindle wall made of chalk, and it's just a beautiful little artefact, and you can imagine someone living in the medieval period making cloth using this lovely little piece. So that concludes our tour, and you can see over the past 3 years of our investigations we've uncovered over 1,000 years of archaeology, starting from the first Romans who crossed the Humber all the way up to the foundation of the medieval village that we can still see today, Little Driffield. We know that these first Romans didn't invade, and they perhaps weren't as warlike as we think them as being. In fact, there seems to be rather peaceful trade happening at our Mancio site, excavated in 2018. And we can see by the later 3rd and 4th century that this is definitely a Romanised landscape, producing agricultural goods that we see in our Roman villa that we excavated in 2019, all the way up to this very well-off established medieval village that we discovered in 2017, that we can see shrinks in size, probably due to the turmoil that was being endured by the people who lived in the village in the mid-14th century. Now, what are we going to do next? Well, in 2020, we hope to be able to go back to where we were in 2018 and further investigate that Mancio site, as we were only able to see a keyhole into what this site would have been like, and this is a particularly rare and important site for archaeology. Now, obviously, this is dependent on the global health situation and government advice, and we've got our fingers crossed that this situation will stabilise, and if anyone who has crowdfunded the dig, we will email you as soon as news becomes available. But in the meantime, you can have a look on Sketchfab. We have 3D models for all of our trenches that we've excavated in all 3 years of the project. You can also check out previous videos that we did for the 2018 and 19 excavations, and also have a look on the dig timeline, because we've got all of our videos, blogs, reports, records, anything you'd want that we've done to do with the project, you'll be able to find on that dig timeline. So check that out. And if you've got any questions left at the end of this video, comment them down below and someone from the team will get back to you. Here is the World Newton Roman hoard. 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 The Newton Roman hoard. The World Newton Roman hoard. The World Newton. Because the words are in the wrong order. It's such a stupid name. Another find you may have heard of is the World Newton Roman hoard. The World Roman Newton hoard find. It's the World Newton Roman hoard. The World Newton Roman hoard. Another find that you may have heard of is the World Roman Newton hoard, which was found, it wasn't found in roughly 307 AD, it was from roughly 307 AD. The World Roman Newton hoard I've heard of is the World Roman Newton hoard, which is from, he found buried with a hawk. Oh, I misread that the first time, that's even cooler. No, it's not, I read that as he was excavating with a hawk. But someone was buried with a hawk, which makes more sense. Now I'm thinking about it, John Mortimer probably didn't have a sidekick of a hawk.